So today we're going to learn all about brushes. Now, as you go to work with brushes, there's two main kinds of brushes. There is a brush that's called a flat, and these ones, if you look at them, it's like the metal around them has been squished flat. Okay, so that would be called a flat, and then they have kind of a rectangle top to them. We also have a brush called a round, and a round, you'll notice that it is round in this metal part. And these brushes are thicker and fuller and come to a point as opposed to the rectangle that this one has. So those are the two main kinds of brushes. Sometimes they're very, very, very tiny. Sometimes they're thick, big, and wide. You can get much bigger brushes than both of these. And you choose the right brush for the job that you have. When you go to hold a brush, you'll generally hold it back a little ways from the tip, not too far out. I mean, you could if that was going to work for the job that you wanted, but generally for a little bit more control, you would hold it up here. Not quite as close as we would with a pencil because it's wet. So we come back generally right where the metal will meet the wood is a really good place to hold. Now, before we paint, we always want to first wet our brush. So we dip into our water. And when we dip into our water, we don't want to mash the brush down. When you smash a brush down, what will happen is the tips will start to fray out, and then the brush won't be nearly as nice to look or to work with. And so you very gently go in and wipe. And now I have a wet brush. And you want your brush to be wet before you put it into the paint. Now, sometimes you don't want to have all that wetness though when you go to paint. So after you dip in, you would then go to your paper towel and go ahead and wipe it off. And then you could dip into your paint. Sometimes though, you'll dip into your water and then you need to take that water into the actual paint that you're using. So if I needed to take that paint into the water I was using, then I wouldn't need to dry it off first. Now, once I have paint on my brush, I could go ahead and paint with it. And then when I was done, I would go into my water and I wouldn't mash down. I would gently wipe. And you can use the edge of the water or of your cup as a way to clean. So you would get it all cleaned off, and then you could wipe it off on the edge of your cup, and you could wipe on your paper towel again. And now when I'm not using it, after I clean it, I would set it down. You don't want to leave your brushes in your water. If you leave your brushes just sitting in your water like this, especially if you have a little bit more water in, what will happen is the water can come in and weaken, and then this part of the brush will fall off. And then also the tips of your brush will start to get like a curve to them, and we want to be able to keep those straight so that we have an easier time painting. So we never just leave our water or our brush sitting in our water like that. So we clean, we wipe off our edge, we dry it on our paper towel. And you'll notice when I dry, I don't mash. I go back and forth very gently, and then I could set it down. Now, choosing the right brush for the job can be a little bit challenging, but let's say I wanted to fill in a big area. If I wanted to fill in a big area, I would probably use my large flat. So I could go and dip into my paint, and this would let me do a large chunk quickly. When I was finished, I would gently go on the edges of my cup, clean, 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 wipe on the edge, and wipe my brush on my paper towel. And I see I'm still getting some purple, so I'm going to clean it a little bit more. Wipe on the edge, that is better. Now, this is a large round. This large round would also work for putting on a large amount of paint, but you'll see how I can pull a really nice line with a thick line with that as well. When I'm finished, I can clean, clean, clean. I'm not mashing my brush, I'm very gentle. I wipe it off on the edge. I clean it off on my paper towel, and I set it down. Now this brush, I can pull an even finer point with, and I haven't used it yet today, so I'm first wetting it. I clean it off on my edge. I clean it off on my paper towel. And now you'll see with this brush, I can pull very fine lines. And I'm doing the dry on dry technique right now. I could do a wet on wet though, where my brush is wet and my paint is wet. So you'll see if I wanted to pull a fine line, I would use a finer brush. And when I'm finished, I would clean, clean, clean. I am not mashing. I would wipe it off on the edge, wipe it off, and set it down. Now, when I was all finished for the day, I would take all of these brushes over to the sink and I would run them under some water with a little bit of soap in my hand, and I would go back and forth like this and really clean them out well because there is still a little bit of paint left in them. If I was working with acrylic paints, I would have to be very, very careful with my brushes because it can dry and become plastic in the brushes. So working with acrylics, you have to be very, very careful to keep your brushes very clean all the time when you're not using them. When I go to store my brushes, so I don't want to store my brushes in like a container like this. If I store them face down, all of the tips are going to get injured. So I could either store them flat like this in a container, or I could store them like this in my cup with all the tips going up, without the water in the cup, of course, though. This way, none of the brush tips will become injured. So the most important thing in brush care is keeping your brushes clean and keeping the shape of your brushes nice. Another thing I can do after I've dried them is I could go in and you see how I reshaped that a little. So that one was a little bit ragged, so I could go ahead and do some shaping of it while it's wet. And if I shape it while it's wet, it will then dry in that nice, clean tip. Now a brush that hasn't been cared for or has been cleaned like this or smashed down like this as you're painting will look like this. And it won't be as nice to work with. So when you clean, you always want to be really, really gentle. You're not ever mashing. And when you're painting, you're also not mashing. You're going up and down, not like this. Now, sometimes we do need to do that technique, and if we're going to do that technique, we would use an old brush. So I might keep an old brush like this around if I want to do that technique. Afterwards, I would clean it, and I could do my best to reshape it. This one, and if you reshape while it's wet, you will be able to get it a little bit better, but you can see how it's still not quite there. If I took some soap into it and left the soap in as I shaped it like this, the soap would then help to hold it, and then that would help to repair that brush and get it back into the proper alignment. Thanks for joining me today.